Go for No by Richard Fenton and Andrea Waltz. Chapter 1. Starting Off, 3 for 3. In the third week of March 1990, the afternoon sun caught the hood of the Oldsmobile as it maneuvered into a space beside a vacant phone booth. The Cutlass wasn't exactly a dream car. A sleek two-seater would have been preferable. But as the standard-issue vehicle for every salesperson at Western Equipment Leasing, it was hard to complain about the price. At 28 years old, life felt stable. The job in the copier division had been steady for 3 years, providing a solid income and a comfortable lifestyle, even if performance metrics placed the results squarely in the average middle of the pack. Autonomy was the real perk of the position. As a leasing representative, the schedule was flexible and the income potential was theoretically uncapped, provided one had the right mindset. Sliding a dime into the payphone, the call went through to the 4th Street Gallery. Elaine Bratton answered. Though her tone suggested a busy afternoon on the gallery floor, the excitement was impossible to contain. When challenged to guess what had happened that day, Elaine jokingly guessed a bank robbery before hearing the real news. 3 sales calls had been made, and all 3 had closed. It was a perfect batting average, and it was only Monday. Elaine's enthusiasm was immediate, her thoughts drifting toward their savings for a Hawaii trip. But a note of caution was necessary. The weekly quota wasn't quite met. 1 more sale was needed to seal the deal. With the good news delivered and domestic plans for Chinese takeout settled, the workday effectively ended right there at 3:30 in the afternoon. The Lakers were scheduled to play the Knicks at the Garden, and thanks to the time difference, there was just enough opportunity to grab some Kung Pao shrimp and settle in for the tip-off. The week was off to a spectacular start, and the rest of the day was reserved for relaxation. Chapter 2. Tying up loose ends. Navigating through the maze of desks on Tuesday morning, the office receptionist called out, surprised to see me. Balancing a precarious mountain of documents in my arms, I retorted that I was merely tying up loose ends, delivering my usual philosophy that the sales profession was effectively 10% finding new business and 90% shuffling paper. I joked that success only seemed to bring more administrative regret. She smiled and hushed me, gesturing toward the imposing corner office occupied by Frank White, the vice president of sales. Frank was not a man who appreciated humor about work ethic. He was a formidable figure, capable of inspiring dread with a mere glance. On the edge of his desk sat a plaque that broadcasted his management philosophy to the entire floor. Hit your quota or hit the bricks. It was a strategy built entirely on intimidation rather than reward. Pure stick, no carrot. And for the most part, it was effective enough to keep me from ever missing a sales goal. The day slowly dissolved into administrative tasks, and the paper avalanche on my desk gradually receded. By 2 o'clock, the backlog was cleared. I figured I could grab a late lunch and still manage to squeeze in 1 sales call before the day ended. I headed down to the basement cafeteria, loaded a tray with meatloaf and a diet soda, and found a quiet table. I had barely taken a bite when Tim McDonald from the marketing department slid into the seat next to me. When a colleague in a corporate environment calls you friend, it usually signals an ulterior motive, so I greeted him with guarded suspicion. Tim complimented my memory before quickly pivoting to his request. The marketing team was organizing a focus group involving a mix of customers and internal staff, and they needed a voice from sales to round out the panel. My internal monologue screamed refusal, yet I found myself asking for the time commitment instead of walking away. He promised it would start at 10 in the morning and last 90 minutes at the absolute most. Before I could reconsider, I had agreed, and Tim vanished as quickly as he had arrived. I sat there realizing I was a pushover, but I justified the concession as a necessary professional obligation, even if it put a dent in my schedule. Chapter 3. That's why I'm in sales. The morning focus group, which Tim had promised would take 90 minutes at most, dragged on interminably and didn't disband until 1:20 in the afternoon. I made a silent vow to avoid the cafeteria indefinitely. Back at my desk, I wolfed down some fast food while shuffling through a stack of prospect cards, trying to identify which lead might yield the single sale I still needed to satisfy the wolves, namely my quota, my wife, and Frank. The telephone interrupted my sorting. It was my brother, Carl, returning a call I had made earlier. When I asked if his recent trip was for business or pleasure, he laughed, pointing out that for him there was no difference, a concept he claimed I struggled to understand. He was calling to invite me to play golf at Bel Air, offering me a chance to finally use my membership. I accepted the standing invitation in theory, but when he suggested we play hooky the very next afternoon, I had to decline. It was tax season for him, which seemed impossible, but he insisted. I countered that it was copier season for me. He gave me an ultimatum of May or nothing, so we agreed he would pick a Saturday later in the spring. As I sat there finishing my burger, the idea of golf lingered. It suddenly occurred to me, why not play around by myself the next morning? It wouldn't be the prestige of Bel Air, but golf was golf. I calculated that an early start, getting on the course by 6, would get me back to the clubhouse by 10, leaving me free to make sales calls by 11. I immediately dialed Strawberry Creek Golf Course to book a time. The voice on the other end crushed my plan for a dawn patrol. They had nothing available until 10:30. I almost hung up, but the rationalization kicked in. I only needed one more sale to round out the week. If I took the 10:30 slot, I reasoned, I could still easily fit in 2 prospect meetings between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I booked the time. That evening, I was in the garage loading my clubs into the trunk when Elaine walked in, carrying garbage bags. She asked if I was playing that weekend, and I beamed, correcting her that I was playing the next morning. She teased that she wished she could take time off midweek, pushing the trash down into the overflowing can. I hit her with my signature line. "That's why I'm in sales, Lainey. That's why I'm in sales." She started to remind me about something, but I cut her off, assuring her I had 2.5 days left to hit my quota and that I never missed. She agreed I was a great salesman, but a terrible psychic. She simply wanted to remind me to take the cans to the curb because tomorrow was trash day. Later, in bed, I arrogantly announced I wasn't taking the garbage out because trash day wasn't until Thursday. Elaine corrected me gently. Tomorrow was Thursday. I argued it was Wednesday, but she returned to her reading, informing me I had lost a day. Panic set in as I mentally retraced the week. Monday had been the 3 sales. Tuesday had been lost to paperwork. Today had been consumed by that focus group. She was right. Tomorrow was Thursday. My work week was evaporating, and I had just committed to playing golf all morning. I decided I would just have to play fast. I closed my eyes, letting visions of birdies and eagles push away the reality of the shrinking schedule. Chapter 4. Strawberry Creek. I stood at the tee of the 14th hole, a 172-yard par 3. I had faced this particular challenge 20 times before, without ever scoring a birdie, but I was determined that today would mark a change in that record. My iron play had been erratic all morning, so I opted for my 3-wood instead. The plan was simple, a gentle, controlled swing to drop the ball softly onto the center of the green. I struck the ball, watching it arc high into the air. Almost immediately I realized the error in my judgment. The 3-wood was too much club for the distance. If the ball managed to hit the green at all, it would land on the very back edge. I yelled for it to stick, trying to command the shot to halt upon impact, but physics had other plans. The morning dew had burned off hours ago, leaving the green hard and fast. The ball skipped off the surface and rolled helplessly down the steep slope leading directly into Strawberry Creek, the course's namesake. My vision of a birdie too instantly dissolved into the likelihood of a bogey 4, provided the ball hadn't found the water. I walked down to the bank and stepped onto the stones littering the creek's edge. Peering in, I spotted my Titleist sitting among the rocks. Resigned to the fact that the hole was lost, I turned to grab the ball scoop from my bag to at least salvage the equipment. Suddenly, my cleats lost their grip on the moss-covered rocks. My balance vanished, and both feet shot out from under me simultaneously. As I tumbled backward into the freezing water, my primary thought was a desperate hope that no one was witnessing this humiliating display of clumsiness. That thought was cut short as the back of my head slammed violently against a massive rock on the creek bottom. As the world turned black, my final terrified hope was that someone had been watching after all. Chapter 5. What on earth is happening? As consciousness slowly returned, I struggled to determine which source of pain was more severe, my hip, which felt like it had taken the main force of impact against a hardwood floor, or the back of my head, which throbbed as if it had collided with the sharp edge of a nightstand. I groaned aloud to Elaine, clutching the back of my skull, complaining that I must have really hurt myself this time. I remarked that I hadn't fallen out of a bed since I was in grade school. I limped slowly toward the door of the bedroom, intentionally exaggerating the limp to elicit some sympathy. But the room remained silent. I announced loudly that I was going to get some ice for my head, yet still there was no reply from my wife. Squinting through the darkness, a sudden realization struck me. Elaine wasn't in the bed. I reached out and flipped the light switch on the wall, and immediately a cold wave of fear washed over me. The bed was indeed empty, but that wasn't the worst of it. It wasn't my bed. It wasn't even our bedroom. With every step I took out into the hallway, my confusion and anxiety intensified. The walls were adorned with exotic artwork, and the carpet beneath my bare feet felt luxuriously thick and unfamiliar. I continued to the end of the corridor where I found a set of large sliding glass doors. I undid the latch and stepped out onto a spacious terrace. Below me lay a breathtaking, perfectly manicured golf course. A wave of dizziness hit me, forcing me to stumble toward a pair of padded chaise lounges where I collapsed into the cushions. My mind raced with questions, trying to grasp the nature of this bizarre reality. What is happening to me? I wondered. What on earth is going on? The exhaustion was overwhelming. I closed my eyes, and as the sun began to rise silently over the green expanse below, I drifted back into sleep. Chapter 6. You Don't Look So Good. I awoke to the glare of the mid-morning sun on my face and the hollow rumble of an empty stomach. Sliding the glass door open, I heard the faint sound of singing drifting up from the floor below. I called out for Elaine, but received no answer. Following the voice, I descended a grand spiral staircase, crossed a foyer paved in marble, and entered a cavernous kitchen. There, I found a woman who was definitely not my wife. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with a heavy build and wearing a white maid's uniform. My sudden appearance startled her so badly that she spun around and lost her grip on the large ceramic platter she was drying, which shattered loudly against the floor. She addressed me as Mr. Bratton, apologizing profusely for her jumpiness, explaining she hadn't expected to see me so late in the morning. I apologized in turn, admitting I had mistaken her for my wife. As she gathered the colorful shards of pottery from the floor, she informed me that Mrs. Bratton was currently in Europe. The news stunned me. When I pressed for details, she eyed me with suspicion, stating that Elaine was there buying art, a fact she claimed I had told her myself. Confused, I asked her who had given her that information. When she pointed out that I had, she hesitated, observing that I didn't look well. I brushed it off as the result of hitting my head on the nightstand, but she suggested calling a doctor. I waved away her concern and retreated to a bathroom to splash water on my face. When I looked up into the mirror, I gasped. The maid was right. I did not look good. The face staring back was mine, yet it wasn't. It was an older iteration of me. There were creases in the skin that hadn't been there the day before, and grey had begun to invade my hair. I rushed back to the master bedroom and stood before a three-way mirror. The reflection revealed a body that was carrying at least 20 pounds more than I was used to. And my muscle tone had vanished completely. Panic set in. I hurried back downstairs to the living room where the maid had started vacuuming. I shouted over the noise, asking for her name. She switched off the machine, looking puzzled, and told me she was Renee. I told her plainly that I was not okay and needed her to answer some questions, no matter how ridiculous they sounded. I confirmed with her that my name was Eric Bratton, that I owned the house, and that she worked for me. Then I asked what I did for a living. She replied that I was a businessman, and then added casually that I also wrote books. "That's not true," I blurted out. I barely had time to read books, let alone write them. I insisted I was a copier salesman. Renee stood her ground, respectfully explaining that she cleaned the study 3 times a week and had seen the books I had written with her own eyes. I raced up the spiral staircase to the 2nd floor, flinging open doors until I found the study. I scanned the bookshelves, and there they were, 3 hardcover books sitting side by side. The titles read, Fail Your Way to Success, One of These Days Is Now, and How to Have the Most Productive Year of Your Life. The spine bore the name Eric James Bratton. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Surely there could be another Eric Bratton, but another Eric James Bratton. I pulled one of the books from the shelf and flipped through it, recognizing none of the text. Then I turned it over. On the back cover of the dust jacket was an author photograph. It was a picture of me. Chapter 7. The Other Me. My knees gave way, and I sank into a large leather chair, my eyes glued to the author biography page in the book I held. The text described Eric James Bratton as a former clothing salesman whose rapid ascent up the corporate ladder epitomized the American dream. It claimed that as a leasing representative for Western Equipment Leasing, he had shattered every conceivable sales record. His first book, Fail Your Way to Success, published in 1989 by Simon & Schuster, was described as an overnight sensation that became a Bible for salespeople. The biography went on to state that in 1994 he had taken the number 3 position at a duplication giant called CopyQuest, becoming the youngest vice president in the company's 30-year history. It noted he was an avid golfer and marathon runner living in La Costa, California, with his wife Elaine, a prominent West Coast art dealer. This was identified as his 3rd book. The timeline made no sense. His first book, published in 1989, I walked over to the desk and checked the calendar. The date stared back at me. March 23rd, 2000. I touched my face, the reality sinking in that somehow 10 years had evaporated, and I was now a decade older. It certainly explained why I looked so rough in the mirror. At the bottom of the page, I spotted a phone number for more information. Without thinking, I dialed it. A cheerful voice answered, "Good afternoon, CopyQuest." I asked to speak with Eric Bratton. When the receptionist asked who was calling, I hesitated before claiming to be a very close friend. She put me on hold, and moments later returned to say Mr. Bratton was just finishing a call and would be with me shortly. My heart hammered in my chest as I waited, wondering what on earth I would say. I assumed he would hang up on me. I knew I would if the roles were reversed. Just as I was about to lose my nerve and disconnect, a self-assured voice came on the line. "Good afternoon, Eric Bratton." I asked for his help, but he naturally wanted to know who I was. I made him promise not to hang up until he'd heard me out. He remarked that my voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. I told him it should, stating that my name was Eric James Bratton, born December 2nd, 1962, in Anchorage, Alaska. His tone turned curt immediately. He accused me of playing a game and told me not to call again. I shouted into the receiver before he could disconnect, explaining that I didn't understand it either, but that I had gone to sleep in my apartment and woken up in his house. He declared it impossible. I challenged him, asking if he had a private line in his study. When he snapped that it was none of my business, I took it as a confirmation and demanded he call it immediately. He asked why he should do that. "Because I'm sitting at your desk," I replied. "And that seems the best way to prove it to you." I hung up. 10 agonizing seconds passed. I had almost convinced myself he wouldn't call when the phone on the desk rang. I grabbed it and spoke quickly, knowing he was likely tempted to call the police. I told him I needed to tell him something only he would know. I recounted an incident from the 7th grade involving a borrowed album from our best friend Steve. I reminded him how we had lied about taking it, broken it into pieces to hide the evidence, and buried it in the backyard. Then, consumed by guilt, we had bought a replacement and left it on Steve's porch the next morning, never telling a soul. There was a silence on the line. Finally, he asked quietly, "Out of curiosity, who was the group?" "Tommy James and the Shondells," I answered. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said. Chapter 8. Looking in the mirror. When he finally walked through the door of the study, the resemblance was undeniable. It was like staring into a mirror that had been heavily retouched. While we were technically identical twins, the differences were stark. He was immaculately dressed, sported a healthy tan, and was clearly about 20 pounds lighter than I was. He studied me in silence for several seconds, then placed his briefcase on the desk and loosened his tie. "You weren't kidding, were you?" he finally said. I replied gravely that I wished I had been. He moved toward a small bar on the far side of the room, remarking that while he didn't usually drink in the afternoon, this occasion seemed to warrant an exception. He offered me one, and I accepted. Handing me a scotch on the rocks, he sank into the leather chair opposite me and asked me to start from the beginning. I asked if he meant from childhood or from that morning, which, for me, was 10 years ago. He told me to start wherever I felt was appropriate. I spent the next hour detailing everything that had happened. He sat quietly, listening intently and nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When I finished, I asked him what he thought. He called it amazing. I admitted I would find it more amusing if our positions were reversed and he had woken up on my floor. He leaned forward with a look of absolute certainty and told me that he didn't believe in accidents. He admitted he didn't know why this was happening yet, but he was convinced there was a reason, and he was sure we would figure it out. Although I wasn't entirely sold on his confidence, his tone put me at ease. He checked his watch and announced he had an important meeting at 4:30 that would wrap up by 6. He proposed we meet back at the house then and go out to dinner to unravel the mystery. In the meantime, he insisted I sit tight, relax, and make myself at home. I laughed at the irony of making myself at home in a house owned by an alternate version of myself, but the tension in my shoulders began to release. He added that I should help myself to whatever clothing I needed. I patted my waist, noting that his pants might be a tight fit, but he assured me I would find something that worked. He promised to see me at 6:30 and told me to save my appetite for a nice dinner downtown. I told him not to worry. I was famished. As he left, I realized I was already beginning to like the other me. Chapter 9. Oh yeah, Elaine. No sooner had the other Eric Bratton backed his shiny black Jaguar out of the driveway than the telephone began to ring. My initial instinct was to reach out and answer it. After all, I reasoned, I was Eric Bratton too, but I stopped myself, letting it ring. After the third chime, the answering machine clicked on. The voice that filled the room was a woman's voice, one I knew instantly and intimately. It was my wife. "Hey, it's me. I'm calling here because the office said you went home for some reason," she began. "I hope everything's okay. Listen, I only have a minute." I smiled to myself. Some things hadn't changed, but her next words revealed a life far different from the one I knew. "I wanted to let you know that things are going great. I made an unbelievable purchase of 30 pieces in Florence, and tomorrow I'm off to Madrid. Call me at the hotel later. Don't worry about the time. Love you. Bye." The machine clicked off. I had been so consumed by my own existential dilemma that I had completely forgotten about Elaine. My Elaine, that is. This version of Elaine was apparently thriving, living out her dream of traveling the globe and acquiring art. But what was my Elaine doing right now? I wondered if she was worried sick about me. Did she even exist in this reality? Only time would tell. I settled in for the rest of the afternoon, reading one of the books I had supposedly written, trying to make sense of a situation that was, quite simply, amazing. Chapter 10. Dinner at Rainwater's. "I can't believe how the skyline has changed in only 10 years, I remarked, as we exited the freeway and headed toward downtown San Diego. My twin chimed in, noting the increased traffic as well. We pulled up to the valet stand at Rainwater's on Kettner, a prestigious restaurant near the Gaslamp Quarter. It was a place I had always aspired to visit, but had never possessed the financial means or the right occasion to justify. Once we were seated, Eric selected a fine bottle of Stag's Leap Cabernet, and we sipped the wine while waiting for our steaks. I broke the silence by mentioning that I had read our book that day. He asked which one, and I clarified that it was Fail Your Way to Success. When he asked for my opinion, I admitted honestly that I had liked it. He seemed genuinely pleased by the compliment as our dinner arrived. He then asked if I had found any clues that might explain our bizarre predicament. I told him that, as far as I could tell, our lives had been virtually identical up to a certain point. We shared the same birthday, the same parents, and the same older brother, Carl. We had attended the same schools, lived in the same neighborhood, and worked the same odd jobs in high school. Even in college, we had both sold suits at Dubin's Clothing for Men. But that, I explained, was where the similarities ended. He asked what I meant by something happened. I pointed out that the experiences detailed in his book mirrored mine exactly right up until his employment at the clothing store. It was there that the timeline seemed to fracture. I brought up a specific event he had written about. An Encounter district manager named Harold. "Do you remember?" I asked. "Do I remember?" he exclaimed. "How could I forget? That's the day that changed my life." That's the problem, I replied. That day never happened to me. He was confused, asking how a day could simply not happen. I clarified that while the day itself had obviously occurred, the events had unfolded differently for me. When he asked if I remembered the conversation with Harold, I had to admit that I couldn't recall a single word the man had said. Wow, he said, realizing the significance of the discrepancy. Then maybe that's where we need to start. Chapter 11. Then, how did you know he was done? I remember it like it was yesterday, the other Eric began, leaning back into the memory. He recounted that we had only been working at Dubin's for about a month when the district manager, Harold, was scheduled for a store visit. The stakes were high. We weren't performing well, and honestly, the fear of losing the job was real. Having just married Elaine, the prospect of unemployment was terrifying. I nodded, remembering that anxiety all too well. Harold arrived around 9:30, and after the usual pleasantries of coffee and donuts, the doors opened at 10. As the first salesman on the floor, I took the first customer. A finely dressed gentleman walked in and announced he needed an entire wardrobe. The interaction was a dream. Within 30 minutes, I'd closed my biggest sale ever. I was certain Harold would be impressed. I confirmed that I remembered that part of the day clearly. After the customer departed, Harold strolled over. He complimented the sale, and I puffed up with pride, announcing the total was $1,100. Harold stood there, looking unmoved. Finally, he asked a question that confused me. I'm just curious, but what did that customer say no to? I shot back defensively, listing the inventory the man had just purchased. A suit, sport coat, 3 shirts, 6 ties, shoes, socks, a belt, and even I asked him what he meant by asking what the customer said no to. Harold waited for my defensiveness to subside before calmly clarifying. He acknowledged what the customer had said yes to, but he insisted on knowing what he had declined. I mentally reviewed the entire transaction before sheepishly admitting that the customer hadn't said no to anything. Harold then delivered the question that would change everything. So, then how did you know he was done? The question hit me like a physical blow. I suddenly realized that the customer hadn't ended the sale. I had. The only reason I had stopped selling was that the customer had reached my mental spending limit. I had never spent more than $1,000 on a shopping trip in my life. So when anyone else crossed that threshold, I assumed they were finished. I told my twin that I remembered the event, but admitted it hadn't impacted me the same way. He insisted that this realization, combined with what Harold said next, was the turning point of his life. Harold had told him that a salesperson never decides when a sale is over, only the customer does. He looked him in the eye and stated that the fear of hearing the word no was the only thing standing between him and greatness. My twin leaned in, emphasizing that he had gone to work that morning hoping merely to keep his job, but had gone home that night realizing he was just 2 letters away from greatness. 2 letters from greatness, I repeated to myself. N and O, no. Chapter 12, The Failure Success Model. You see, before that moment with Harold, my alter ego continued, I had been operating with the wrong model of success and failure. He paused mid-sentence, signaling the waiter to clear our plates, and simultaneously borrowed his pen. He turned the restaurant menu over and began to draw on the back. He sketched a diagram with me in the center, success on the far left, and failure on the far right. He explained that for years he believed his mission was to move towards success and away from failure, but that day with Harold had shattered that illusion. He drew a new model, me at the starting line, failure in the middle, and success at the finish line. He tapped the paper, emphasizing that failure wasn't the opposite of success, but a stepping stone right in the middle of the path to get there. Most people, he argued, reach the failure sign and turn back, assuming they're going the wrong way, never realizing that success is waiting just on the other side. He went on to criticize the way modern corporate culture treats the word failure. Leaders and managers use soft euphemisms like mistake, glitch, or setback to avoid the harsh reality of the word. He argued that fail might have 4 letters, but it isn't a 4-letter word in the profane sense. By sugarcoating it, we treat failure as something deadly to be avoided at all costs. The only way to desensitize oneself to the fear of failure, he insisted, is to use the word and do the action until it loses its power. It's the same with the word no, he continued. He asked if I had ever watched a child in a grocery store. He painted a vivid picture of a kid named Billy asking his mother for a cookie. The mother says no. Billy asks again. She says no, again. He asks, please. She refuses. He tries, pretty please. She yells, no. He asks why. She gives the standard, because I said so. 10 seconds later, Billy asks again, and the mother finally caves, handing him the cookie just to get some peace. I laughed, recognizing the scene immediately. He pointed out the lesson. Billy didn't get the cookie because he was polite, but because he was tenacious. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, we lose that natural persistence. Billy didn't take the rejection personally. He just knew that if he pushed long enough through the no's, there was a yes waiting at the end. That, my twin concluded, was exactly what Harold had helped him remember. Chapter 13. Where Our Paths Parted. After the conversation with Harold, I started really looking at what sets successful people apart from the masses, my alter ego continued, and their willingness to fail was at the top of the list. He cited a grim statistic. Only 5% of the population retires without financial assistance. 36% die before retirement, 6% are still working, and a staggering 53% are dependent on friends, relatives, or charity. He posed the question of who makes up that lucky 5%. The answer, he asserted, was simply the people who had failed the most during their lifetimes. I noted the irony, and he agreed, calling it sad. He then demanded I repeat a phrase after him. I like to fail. I hesitated, admitting that my problem was precisely that I didn't like to fail. He corrected me immediately, explaining that I was still conflating the act of failing with the identity of being a failure. Successful people fail eagerly, he argued, while failures avoid failing. The entire purpose of failing more is to achieve success so that one doesn't end up looking back on life as a failure. He insisted again. Repeat after me. I like to fail. I like to fail, I said, lacking conviction. He escalated the chant. I fail big and I fail often. I repeated it. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but no can never hurt me. I burst out laughing at the absurdity of it, but he threatened to make me pay the check if I didn't say it. I complied, repeating the twisted nursery rhyme. He nodded, satisfied, reinforcing that the word no doesn't have to be debilitating. It was the most important lesson Harold had tried to teach me, but I hadn't been ready then. He asked if I was ready now. I nodded, and he promised that from this second forward, my life would never be the same. I sat there pondering if a subtle shift in attitude could truly have such a massive impact. But there was one detail I desperately needed to clarify. I asked him what happened after the conversation with Harold. He recalled going home that night and telling Elaine they would never worry about money again. The next morning, he went into work a new man, on fire. He finished that year as the #1 salesman in the store and the following year as the #1 in the chain. He looked at me, surprised. I didn't remember that. No, I don't remember that, I said quietly, because that's not what happened next for me. What happened to you? He asked. My sales didn't improve, I admitted. As a matter of fact, they got worse. 2 months later, I was fired. We sat in silence, contemplating how a single event had launched one life into the stratosphere while leaving the other to crash and burn. Finally, the waiter brought the check. I watched as Eric James Bratton, the man who built his success on failure, signed the receipt and slid his Platinum American Express card back into his wallet. As we stood to leave, I noticed the waiter staring at the scribbled diagram on the back of the menu, likely wondering what on earth it was. I wanted to tell him it was the difference between massive success and mediocrity. I wanted to shout that it was his future. In that moment, I realized that for me, this would always be the lesson I had been privileged enough to receive a decade ago, but had chosen to ignore. I had proven the old saying true. Some people stumble over the truth, pick themselves up, and continue on as if nothing had happened. Chapter 14. An invitation I couldn't refuse. I passed Thursday night in the comfort of the guest bedroom. My slumber was broken early the next morning by a knock on the door and my twin's voice announcing that breakfast was ready. We sat over fresh fruit and muffins, exchanging small talk about sports and the weather, but inevitably, the conversation circled back to the bizarre reality we were sharing, what we had decided to call the situation. I asked him if he had mentioned our predicament to Elaine when he spoke to her that morning. He admitted he hadn't, reasoning that there was no point in worrying her, or more accurately, making her think he had lost his mind. He then shifted to logistics. He told me his home was mine, until Elaine returned from Spain the following Tuesday, at which point my presence would become significantly more complicated. But for the immediate future, we needed a plan. He outlined his schedule. He had an 8 o'clock flight to Monterey to deliver a presentation in San Francisco the following day. He offered me a choice. I could stay behind and relax at the house, or I could accompany him on the trip. The decision was easy. The prospect of sitting alone in a strange house while the maid vacuumed around me and silently judged my appearance was unappealing. I told him I would prefer to tag along, seeing it as an opportunity to learn more from him. He agreed instantly, declaring it settled. I hesitated, realizing a practical problem. I confessed with some embarrassment that I had no money on me. I generally didn't make a habit of sleeping with my wallet in my pajamas, just in case I fell into a different dimension. He laughed off the concern and then pivoted to a more exciting topic. He asked if I still played golf. When I confirmed that I did, he dropped a bombshell. He invited me to join him and 2 of his top salespeople for a round the next morning. We had a 7:30 tea time at Pebble Beach, and I would complete the foursome. My jaw nearly hit the floor. Pebble Beach was a dream destination. I accepted immediately, but then wondered how we would explain my presence. He suggested we stick to the truth, or at least a version of it. We would simply tell everyone I was his twin. Chapter 15, A Time for Reflection. I whiled away the better part of the morning browsing through books that, from my perspective, wouldn't be written for years to come. I also spent some time watching daytime television, noting with some amusement that the quality of talk shows had clearly deteriorated over the decade. But mostly, my mind kept drifting back to the conversation from the previous night. I found myself mourning the years I had squandered operating under a broken model of success and failure. The realization that I had wasted so much time avoiding no felt almost criminal. Driven by a need to understand more, I returned to the study and pulled the copy of Fail Your Way to Success from the shelf. I decided to review the concepts with a new level of scrutiny, reading the book from cover to cover. I reasoned that if I ever woke up back in my own bed, I would kick myself for not having studied the material while I had the chance. Near the back of the book, I discovered a fold-out chart titled The 5 Failure Levels. It categorized the progression of failure into distinct stages. Level 1 was the ability to fail. The text explained that 100% of people on Earth possess the ability to fail. It is the universal starting point. However, because most people possess an intense desire to avoid failure at all costs, 80% of the population never moves beyond this basic level. Level 2 was willingness to fail. This stage is reached by people who develop an acceptance of failure as a natural byproduct of seeking success. The chart noted that fewer than 20% of people ever sustain this level. Level 3 was wantingness to fail. This went beyond mere tolerance. It described developing a desire to fail based on the inner faith that personal and financial growth would inevitably follow. Fewer than 5% of people ever reach this stage. Level 4 was failing bigger and faster. This level was for those who concluded that if failing is good, then failing faster is better. It involved increasing the failure rate by pursuing huge goals worthy of the effort. Finally, level 5 was failing exponentially. This final stage was reserved for rare individuals who understood that massive success requires multiplication of effort. These people enlist others to fail with them, understanding that while individual failure leads to individual success, group failure equals group success. Staring at the chart, inspiration struck. I ripped the page out of the book, folded it several times, and tucked it securely into the front pocket of my trousers. I remembered that in movies, time travelers always bring back some physical artifact as proof of their journey. If I ever managed to return to my life in 1990, this piece of paper would be my evidence. I closed the book just as I realized the time. The car would be arriving shortly to take us to the airport for the flight to Monterey. Site start. Site 334 to 354. Chapter 16. This is your captain speaking. The limousine arrived at the airport precisely on schedule, but the destination was not the bustling terminal I had anticipated. Instead, the driver deposited us at the edge of a desolate private airstrip, right next to a diminutive 4-passenger jet that looked frighteningly fragile. Eric noticed my hesitation immediately and asked what was wrong. I tried to mask my genuine terror with humor, quipping that I had a strict personal policy against flying in any vehicle that could fit inside my garage. My twin murmured to himself, recalling that he, or rather we, used to be afraid of small planes. He dismissed the fear instantly, declaring it was too late to change plans now and ordered me to hop in. I asked where the pilot was. With a theatrical bow, he announced, "Captain Bratton, at your service." My jaw dropped. I asked in utter disbelief if this meant I actually flew planes in the future. He corrected me sharply, stating that I wouldn't be flying anything if I continued to let my fears dictate my actions. He ordered me into the plane. I climbed in with significant reluctance, strapping myself tightly into the seat as my daredevil alter ego fired up the engine. Before long, we were accelerating down the runway and lifting off toward the sky. Over the drone of the engine, he shouted a line from a song, encouraging me to do something every day that scared me. I shouted back through clenched teeth that I had already met my quota for terror for the day and asked if we could land. He told me to stop fixating on the fear and look at the positive side. I was expanding my comfort zone. He explained that a comfort zone is never static. It is always in a state of either expansion or retraction. He urged me to recognize how courageous I was being. When I argued that I wasn't being courageous, I was shaking with fear, he corrected my definition. Courage, he stated, is not the absence of fear. True courage is acting in the face of fear. It is being afraid of something and doing it anyway. I mocked him with a feigned evangelist tone, shouting, "Do the thing and ye shall have the power." "Amen," he replied. For the next 10 minutes, I focused entirely on maintaining a facade of bravery. Surprisingly, just as he had predicted, the fear began to recede. My heart rate slowed, and I actually began to appreciate the experience. He noticed my relaxation and commented on it. I quipped that my pulse was finally under triple digits. He told me to sit tight while he got us to cruising altitude and engaged the autopilot so we could talk. I stared out the tiny window, watching him manipulate the controls with confidence as we glided over the Pacific Ocean, banking right to head north up the coast toward Monterey. Chapter 17. Learning to go for no. So, you're really trying to tell me that your willingness to hear the word no made everything you're enjoying in your life right now possible? I asked, trying to wrap my head around the concept. No, Eric, I'm not saying that at all, he replied. He clarified that his willingness to hear the word no was merely what got his career on the right track, but it was his wantingness to fail that had catapulted him to the top. I admitted that I'd read about this in his book, but I asked him to explain the distinction to me one more time. He obliged, explaining that a willingness to fail means a person will tolerate just enough failure to get what they need from life, and not a bit more. A wantingness, on the other hand, implies that you aren't just tolerating the no's in your life, you are actively beginning to seek them out. He insisted that when you develop a true wantingness to fail, the experience of rejection actually starts to become fun. Who in their right mind thinks rejection is fun? Rejection is awful, I argued, unable to see his logic. Says who? He shot back immediately. He challenged me, asking where it was written that rejection had to be awful. Why, he posited, couldn't rejection be viewed as merely annoying or amusing or even exciting and energizing? He reminded me that while we have absolutely no control over the actions of other people, we retain total and complete control over how we react to them. He asked me to imagine what would happen if we decided to make every no and every rejection something that empowered us rather than defeated us. Instead of avoiding rejection or even just tolerating it, what if we made the conscious decision to go out of our way to actually go for no? Chapter 18. The most empowering word in the world. Wait a minute, did you just say go for no? I asked, making sure I had heard him correctly over the noise of the plane. Yes, he replied, his tone entirely casual. I asked him how that could possibly work. He explained the mechanics of the philosophy simply. Instead of setting goals based on the number of yeses you plan to achieve in a week, You set goals based on the number of no's you intend to collect. I told him straight out that the idea was crazy. You want crazy? He challenged. He told me about one of the salespeople we were scheduled to play golf with the next morning. This individual had a vanity license plate that translated to "in love with no." The previous year, this salesperson had won a company award specifically for being rejected by more prospects than anyone else in the entire organization. I looked at him in disbelief, asking if they actually gave out awards for failing. He confirmed it was one of their highest honors, noting that the recipient received a standing ovation from their peers at the annual banquet. I scoffed at the idea of being praised for failure, but he cut me off with the punchline. When that salesperson returned to their table, they placed the award for the most no's right next to the trophy for being the #1 salesperson in the country. He let that sink in. The person who failed the most was also the top performer. 4 years running. He then recounted a story about a famous motivational speaker they had hired for a sales conference. The speaker had worked the crowd into a frenzy, telling them that yes was the most empowering word in the English language, leading a chant of yes, yes, yes. My twin admitted the energy was high, but the message was positively wrong. He refused to let 800 salespeople leave with the wrong mindset. So after the speaker left, he climbed onto the stage to correct the record. He told the team that yes is the easy part of the job. It teaches you nothing. The truly empowering word is no. Learning to hear no repeatedly without quitting is what builds character and self-esteem. 2 letters from greatness, I said, echoing the phrase from our dinner conversation. That's right, he agreed. N-O. Chapter 19. Setting no. Goals. Would you agree that the average salesperson slows down when he or she reaches their quota? My mentor asked from the pilot's seat. I confirmed that I did. He asked why I thought that happened. I ventured a guess that perhaps they were rewarding themselves for their accomplishment. He corrected me, arguing that they were actually rewarding themselves by ruining their chances for a record-breaking performance. The real reason, he explained, was a desire to stay within their comfort zones and avoid the pain of rejection. He posited that people classify the pain required for survival as necessary pain, but view anything beyond that threshold as unnecessary pain. It becomes incredibly easy to dodge extra effort because the mind labels it as needless suffering. I admitted that was exactly what I had done that week. I had started with a fantastic Monday, going 3 for 3, and then squandered the rest of the week on busy work and distractions, only to end up in this alternate reality. He quoted Ben Franklin, noting that success has ruined many a man, and suggested we analyze what would have happened if I had been setting no goals instead of yes goals. He asked for my original sales goal for the week. I told him I wanted to close 4 sales. He then asked how many calls I typically made, and I replied that I aimed to get in front of 20 prospects. He ran the numbers. If my goal had been to collect 16 no's rather than 4 yeses, my perfect Monday would have been a problem. Instead of being ahead of the game with 3 sales, I would have been drastically behind on my rejection quota. I realized immediately that I would have been forced to increase my call volume to hit the 16 no's. He validated my epiphany. Chasing success had caused me to decrease my activity, whereas chasing failure would have driven me to increase it. I excitedly applied the logic to a friend of mine named Paul, who worked in network marketing. If his target was to get 10 people to a meeting and he had a 5% success rate, his goal shouldn't be the 10 attendees. It should be getting rejected by 190 people. My twin called it the get rejected and get rich plan. I repeated the phrase to myself, letting the concept sink in. He then confessed something that shocked me. He told me he hadn't set a traditional success-oriented goal in nearly 10 years. He only set goals for the number of no's he intended to collect. When I expressed disbelief, he stood firm. He explained that focusing on results-oriented goals would likely cause him to slow down, just as I had. Instead, he focused on a behavior-oriented goal, constantly increasing his rate of failure. He had total faith that if he set his failure goals high enough and performed his best in every interaction, the successes would inevitably follow. I admitted I understood the logic, though it would take some getting used to. He assured me that it had taken time for him as well, and even longer for Elaine. But once she had embraced the philosophy, she became unstoppable. I asked how Elaine applied the concept. He revealed that she now owned 3 art galleries, 2 in San Diego and 1 in Santa Barbara, employing 45 salespeople. He cited research showing that 85% of interactions between retail salespeople and shoppers end without the salesperson ever asking for a buying decision. To combat this, Elaine trained her staff with a strict rule. No customer leaves an Elaine Bratton gallery without saying no at least once. Chapter 20. When you're hot, you're hot. That brings us to another critical benefit of setting no goals, my twin continued as he adjusted the flight controls. It provides built-in protection against the most common mistake salespeople make, prematurely ending a hot streak. He explained the phenomenon I knew all too well. When a salesperson hits a rhythm and starts collecting yeses, their instinct, and usually their action, is to back off and relax, effectively rewarding themselves with downtime. However, if that same salesperson were operating under a no goal, a streak of successes would actually have the opposite effect. Think about it, he urged. If your goal is to collect rejection and you keep getting sales, you aren't hitting your goal. A hot streak of yeses puts you behind schedule. Instead of slowing down, you have to step up your activity just to find the no's you need. He offered a sports analogy to drive the point home. He asked if a baseball manager would ever dream of benching a star player simply because they were in the middle of a hitting streak. I replied that they wouldn't, of course. Exactly, he said. So why does a salesperson voluntarily bench themselves when they are hot? It makes 0 sense. You never want to interrupt your own momentum. He turned to me, the teacher testing the student. When you went 3 for 3 on Monday, Eric, what did you do? I answered quietly. I took myself out of the game. Precisely, he said, not letting me off the hook. If you had been going for no, those 3 sales would have left you significantly short of your rejection goal. You would have kept making calls to find your no's. We will never know what kind of incredible week you might have had if you hadn't stopped working. Hey, don't rub it in, I joked, feigning defensiveness. He looked at me seriously. I want to rub it in. I want to rub it in until it hurts, because if it stings badly enough, maybe next time you'll actually change your behavior. Don't worry, I assured him. It stings plenty. Chapter 21. Next. You've probably heard this example before, but it remains the definitive illustration of the relationship between failure and success, my twin said. He brought up Abraham Lincoln, noting that the man had less than a year of formal education, failed twice in business, and lost 8 out of 10 elections before finally winning the presidency in 1860. Yet, he pointed out, history doesn't remember Lincoln for those defeats. He is revered for preserving the Union and abolishing slavery. He asked where the nation would be if Lincoln had possessed a below-average failure quotient. Failure quotient? I asked, testing the phrase. He defined it as the specific capacity an individual has to endure failure before achieving success. It is a measure of how many times a person is willing to be knocked down and get back up, fully aware they will likely be knocked down again. He argued that this single factor, the failure quotient, is what determines whether a person achieves their dreams or settles for a mediocre existence. Fortunately for the country, Lincoln's quotient was exceptionally high. I chuckled, admitting that mine was fairly low. If I hit a streak of 3 or 4 rejections, my instinct was to stop for a donut. He continued with examples, asking if I knew that R.H. Macy failed 7 times to launch a department store before finally succeeding. He then brought up Harland Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken. He described a man who, at 65, received his first Social Security check and realized it wasn't enough to survive. Sanders hit the road to sell his chicken recipe to restaurant owners. My twin asked if I could guess how many restaurants he signed up during the first 2 years of traveling. I shook my head. 0, he stated. Not a single one. He emphasized that any normal person would have surrendered, but the Colonel was extraordinary. He refined his presentation, persisted, and finally got one yes, then another, until the success became finger-licking good. He pivoted to a different profession to drive the point home. He asked me to imagine the life of a doctor. Every physician knows that eventually they will lose a patient. If every doctor decided to quit medicine the moment they lost someone, the profession would vanish. So, what do? I asked. He explained that in medical school, doctors are taught a magic word to help them push past the pain and continue their work. When a patient is lost, the only rational approach is to focus immediately on the person who can still be saved. The word is simply next. He contrasted this with how most of us handle failure. We analyze it, obsess over it, and let it bury us. Instead, we should adopt the physician's mindset. Acknowledge the result, say next, and move on. I remarked that he made it sound easy, though I knew it wasn't. I confess that I wished I understood the root of my reluctance to hear the word no. He dismissed the need for psychoanalysis immediately. "It doesn't matter where it came from," he exclaimed. He argued that the origins of the fear, whether childhood upbringing or a traumatic sales experience, were irrelevant. Motivational tapes couldn't coax the fear away, and threats wouldn't scare it off. The only solution, he insisted, was to numb myself to the word. I asked if he meant I should ignore it. "No, just the opposite," he corrected. Numbing oneself isn't about denial. It's about experiencing the rejection so frequently that it loses its emotional power. He reminded me of the old adage, do the thing you fear, and the fear will vanish. He offered one final thought as we prepared to land. He reminded me that Babe Ruth is celebrated for his 714 home runs, not his record-setting 1,330 strikeouts. In the end, no one remembers the failures, only the successes, and eventually, neither would I. With that, he shifted his attention back to the cockpit controls, and we began our gradual descent toward Monterey. Chapter 22. A Morning at the Beach. The telephone rang in the pitch black of the early morning, jerking me from sleep. I fumbled for the receiver, disoriented, only to be greeted by a cheerful voice announcing my 5 o'clock wake-up call. As the fog of sleep cleared, the reality of my location rushed in. It was Saturday. I was in a suite at the inn at Spanish Bay, and I was about to play a round at Pebble Beach. Adrenaline replaced fatigue. I showered, dressed, and headed to the restaurant, where I found my twin already attacking a plate of eggs Benedict. He asked how I slept, then immediately shifted to the competitive nature of the morning, warning me that he intended to beat me soundly. I challenged him to a wager, though he quickly reminded me of my penniless status. He proposed a different kind of steak. Low man gets to sit in the audience this afternoon, and high man gives the presentation, he offered with a sly grin. I stared at him, confused. I pointed out that his book jacket described him as someone who loved speaking to large groups. He laughed, advising me not to believe everything I read. He confessed that he was actually terrified of the stage. Every time he was introduced, he questioned his sanity, and his heart felt like it would pound out of his chest. When I asked why he did it, he returned to his mantra about the comfort zone. It is never static, he reminded me. It is either expanding or shrinking. He knew that if he surrendered to his fear in one area, it would inevitably weaken his resolve in others. We met his colleagues, Kurt and Cheryl, at the first tee. Adhering to our cover story, I was introduced as Edward, Eric's twin brother, who was considering a career in sales. My drive was straight but short, and it quickly became apparent I would not be the low scorer of the day. The other three outdrove me significantly. I hopped into a cart with Kurt. Seizing the opportunity, I asked Kurt for his honest opinion on my brother's philosophy, specifically the concepts of going for no and increasing one's failure quotient. I asked if it actually worked for the average person. "Not for very long," Kurt replied enigmatically. Before I could process the answer, he clarified. He explained that within a very short time, anyone who adopts the strategy ceases to be average. He told me that before working for my brother, he had suffered from pike syndrome. He described a scientific experiment involving a pike placed in an aquarium with minnows separated by a glass partition. The pike would repeatedly smash its nose against the invisible barrier, trying to reach the food, until eventually it gave up. When the scientists removed the glass, the pike remained on its side of the tank, swimming in circles and starving despite the fact that the minnows were now accessible. It had been conditioned by the pain of the impact to accept a limitation that no longer existed. Kurt explained that most people are identical to that pike. They experience a few painful rejections, bump their noses, and learn to quit. Even when the barriers are removed and the opportunities are wide open, they remain trapped within their own imaginary walls. He told me he owed my brother a deep debt of gratitude, not because he taught him how to succeed, but because he taught him to enjoy the process of bumping his nose. Chapter 23. You don't want to buy insurance, do you? As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the breathtaking scenery of the Monterey Peninsula, the gap in skill between my twin and myself became painfully obvious. By the end of the front nine, his handicap was clearly in the single digits, while I was struggling to keep my score respectable. At the 10th hole, Eric suggested a switch, placing me in the cart with Cheryl so I could glean some wisdom from her perspective. I opened the conversation by asking if she too subscribed to the philosophy of failing more. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. She pointed out that statistically, 80% of salespeople wash out in their first year for one singular reason. They simply don't make enough calls. I admitted that I'd always believed success was a matter of skill and talent. Cheryl laughed, declaring that skill is highly overrated. She explained that while she had attended endless training seminars to polish her technique, she watched less talented but more motivated people zoom past her simply because they were willing to tell their story to more people. She argued that raw activity almost always beats slick technique. To illustrate her point, she shared a story about an insurance company in Chicago. The company was suffering from declining profits and averaging a dismal 2.5 sales per agent per month. They hired a high-priced consultant who immediately diagnosed the problem. The agents weren't seeing enough prospects. The executives, expecting a complex, sophisticated solution for the money they were paying, were skeptical of such a simple answer. To prove his point, the consultant initiated a radical experiment. He took a cross-section of the sales force and sent them out to knock on doors in cold territory. He stripped away all their qualifying techniques and gave them a script that was intentionally terrible. When a homeowner opened the door, the agent was instructed to say, "You don't want to buy any life insurance, do you?" Their only goal was to see how many times they could deliver that negative line in a single day. I anticipated the result, assuming the approach failed miserably. Cheryl confirmed that 59 out of 60 people agreed with the agent and told them to get lost. However, 1 out of 60 would inevitably reply, "Actually, I do need some insurance. Come on in." I remarked that a 1 in 60 closing ratio sounded terrible. Cheryl corrected my perspective because the pitch was so short and direct. The agents were able to approach 60 people in a single 8-hour shift. Consequently, they went from making 2 sales a month to making 1 sale every single day. The lesson was clear. If you want to accelerate your success, you must increase the speed at which you fail. I drew a parallel to a telemarketing strategy I had heard of, where callers ask immediately if a prospect is interested. If the answer is no, they hang up instantly rather than wasting time on a pitch, allowing them to make 10 times as many calls to find the qualified buyers. Cheryl agreed, offering a final metaphor. She likened sales to gold mining. You don't really look for gold. You focus on removing dirt. The success doesn't come from the gold itself, but from the volume of dirt you are willing to move to find it. Chapter 24. No doesn't mean never. After finishing the 18th hole, Eric suggested we have lunch at the Pebble Beach Clubhouse, and soon I was enjoying the best BLT I had ever tasted. With the game behind us, Eric turned the conversation back to business, asking Kurt and Cheryl if they would be willing to answer a question for my benefit. When they agreed, he asked them to identify the single most important piece of advice, beyond the core concepts of going for no and increasing failure rates, that they would offer to someone striving for outrageous sales success. Kurt playfully deferred to Cheryl, putting her on the spot. Cheryl began by offering a simple but profound shift in perspective. One must learn that no doesn't mean never. It simply means not yet. She backed this up with hard data, noting that research indicates 44% of salespeople quit after the first no. Another 22% give up after the second, 14% after the third, and 12% after the fourth. I did the math in my head and realized that meant 92% of salespeople give up without ever asking for the order a 5th time. Cheryl nodded, pointing out the tragic irony. Studies also show that 60% of customers reject a proposal 4 times before finally saying yes. Therefore, the quickest way to separate oneself from the mediocre majority is to commit to getting at least 5 no's from every single prospect. I asked if she actually tracked that, and she confirmed she did. She keeps records of exactly how many times each prospect has turned her down, refusing to leave an office without securing at least one no. She explained that a firm no is infinitely better than the ambiguous, "Let me think about it," because a specific refusal allows her to ask why and uncover the real obstacles to the sale. Kurt chimed in, noting that her philosophy reminded him of the Alan Breed story. When I asked who that was, Kurt asked if I had an airbag in my car. He explained that Alan Breed invented airbag sensor technology back in 1967 and offered it to Detroit automakers, only to be told to get lost. The industry saw the invention as expensive and unnecessary, but Breed refused to accept the rejection. He spent nearly 20 years lobbying Congress until legislation was finally passed mandating airbags. Eric noted that it took immense fortitude to withstand that level of failure. Kurt added that even after the legislation, it took another decade for the real payoff to arrive. But in 1995, nearly 30 years after the initial rejection, Breed Technologies sold 23 million sensors, netting a profit of $120 million. Eric observed that while most people would have heard no, Breed chose to hear not yet. Cheryl then posed a final thought-provoking question. Did Breed earn that $120 million in 1995? Or did he actually earn $4 million a year for every single year he was willing to hear the word no? Chapter 25. The Big Enchilada. "Okay, Kurt, you're up," Eric said, shifting in his chair and turning his attention to the tanned, handsome salesman. Kurt didn't hesitate. He stated his philosophy simply: if you're going to fail, fail big. When Eric asked him to elaborate, Kurt explained the logic behind the statement. He argued that if a salesperson is destined to hear the word no, it is far better to hear it from a client who has the potential to buy 20 copiers rather than one who might only buy 2. He urged us to seek rejection from the purchasing agent of a company that orders 40,000 gallons of supplies, rather than a small business ordering 40. He broke it down using simple math. If he called on 100 small accounts, each with the potential to lease 2 machines, and maintained a 10% closing ratio, he would end up moving 20 units. However, if he focused his energy on large accounts that needed 20 machines each, he would only need to close a single sale to achieve the exact same result. I summarized his point, suggesting he meant we should avoid small accounts. Kurt corrected me, clarifying that he had nothing against small accounts, as they often grow into large ones. His point was that many salespeople intentionally avoid chasing the big enchilada because they are terrified of blowing the big one. He dismissed this fear as silly, reminding us that in the end, a no is a no, regardless of the account size, but the rewards for the yeses are disproportionately huge. Chapter 26. Failing exponentially. Eventually, the moment arrived for Kurt and Cheryl to reverse the roles and put my twin on the spot. Cheryl asked Eric what he believed was the single most crucial factor in achieving outrageous sales success. Eric initially demurred, noting that he had spent the last 3 days lecturing on the subject and was sure I had heard enough of his advice. I chuckled, assuring him I couldn't get enough. He agreed to answer, but clarified that his perspective now came from a management standpoint. He offered 2 key insights. First, he explained that a primary key to creating massive success is understanding the necessity of failing exponentially. He reasoned that an individual can only fail at a certain speed. Therefore, great leaders must help everyone within the organization understand the need to fail faster collectively. To illustrate, he used the example of a company with a sales force of 100 people. If each salesperson increased their activity just enough to receive 5 additional no's per day, not necessarily by finding new people, but by getting more rejection from current opportunities, the math becomes staggering. 100 salespeople multiplied by 200 working days a year, multiplied by 5 extra no's a day, equals 100,000 additional no's per year. He emphasized that this increase occurs without adding any cost, yet the impact on organizational results is monumental. I compared this to the classic story of Thomas Edison. I recited the famous anecdote where a reporter asked Edison how it felt to fail 10,000 times to invent the light bulb, to which Edison replied, he hadn't failed, but had simply discovered 10,000 ways that wouldn't work. Eric agreed, but pointed out that most people miss the sequel to that story. After those initial failures, Edison hired a team of other inventors to work in his laboratory. He knew these men weren't as talented as he was, but he hired them because he realized that even with 10,000 failures under his belt, he wasn't failing fast enough on his own. Edison became the poster child for combining failing bigger, failing faster, and failing exponentially. Eric concluded that exponential failure requires a leader to be an exponent, an advocate and champion of the concept. He lamented that too many executives reach the top and suddenly forget the failures that got them there. They begin to avoid failure, and when a leader shows fear, the entire organization senses it. The employees figure that if the boss is afraid of something, they should probably be afraid of it too. Chapter 27. Celebrating success and failure. Eric, you said there were 2 things leaders can do to create outrageous success. What's the second? I asked, eager to hear the counterpart to exponential failure. The second is to reward people for their failures, not just their successes, he responded. He pointed out the common corporate tendency to rush over and congratulate people when they close a sale, while ignoring or even shunning those who are struggling. He asked how often companies go out of their way to congratulate people specifically for failing. Virtually never, I admitted. Exactly, he said. He referenced the greatest management principle in the world by Michael LeBeouf, quoting the axiom that managers don't get what they beg for, wish for, or pray for. They get what they reward. He explained the logic. If a leader truly believes that seeing a high volume of potential customers is the path to success, then they must reward the behavior of seeing those people regardless of the immediate outcome. While he supported rewarding success, he insisted it shouldn't be done to the exclusion of recognizing those who display a true willingness and wantingness to fail. Neglecting salespeople just because their yeses haven't fallen into place yet is a critical error. He described how CopyQuest implements this philosophy. They recognize the top 10 salespeople with a producer's pin to honor results. However, they also recognize the 10 salespeople with the greatest number of failed attempts with the Go for No award. He noted that both Kurt and Cheryl had made both lists. It's funny, Cheryl interjected, but the Go for No trophy meant more to me than the producer's pin. I looked at her in disbelief, but she explained her reasoning. The producer's pin was merely recognition of her external achievement, the numbers on the board. The Go for No trophy, however, was a validation of her internal desire and persistence. Kurt agreed, adding that they already get recognized for their production every week via their paychecks, making the failure award unique. Eric noted the interesting evolution of the awards. Initially, they thought they were creating 2 separate categories of recognition. Over time, however, the lists had become nearly identical mirrors of one another. That's because we've caught on to the concept that winning a Go for No award almost assures that you'll end up with a producer's pin, Eric said. Kurt concluded the thought with the perfect summary. Yes is the destination, no is how you get there. Chapter 28. The blink of an eye. The helicopter touched down on the roof of the Moscone Center, situated in the heart of downtown San Francisco. It was the venue for the annual conference of the International Society of Sales Executives. We were greeted and promptly escorted to a small green room, a quiet space reserved for speakers to prepare and relax before taking the stage. I asked our escort how many people would be in the audience, and he informed us there would be about 3,000. I immediately glanced at Eric, who managed a smile despite the obvious nervousness he must have been feeling. Having never spoken to a group larger than 20, I could only imagine the swarm of butterflies my twin was trying to tame. Our escort left to check on the final arrangements, leaving us alone in the room. Noticing his contemplative expression, I asked if he was doing a last-minute review. He replied that he was deciding on his final story and thought he would share something that had happened just the previous afternoon at his office. He recounted receiving a call from a salesman trying to sell him permanent retirement property. I asked what that meant, and he clarified it was a politically correct term for a gravesite. He told the salesman, "No thank you," and hung up. 10 minutes later, the salesman called back with a persistent pitch. "Mr. Bratton, your time on the planet Earth is little more than the blink of an eye, but your time after that is forever." I admitted it was a good pitch and asked for his response. He laughed and said he told the man that he and I would be spending eternity with Elaine, permanently retired, on a beautiful hillside at Forest Lawn. The experience, he explained, made him reflect on the common desire to go out a winner. He realized how silly that sentiment actually is. Statistically, if a person continues to challenge themselves until the day they die, the odds are high that they will fail at the very last thing they attempt. He mused that the final act of the world's most successful people will likely be a failure. He continued, noting that at 38, he figured he had another 40 years left to do great things. While he couldn't predict the specific successes in his future, he was 100% certain that achieving them would require continued risk-taking and outrageous courage. The escort returned to lead us to the side of the stage just as Eric was being introduced. We climbed the stairs together, my body double and I, over the rising roar of the crowd. He leaned in and spoke softly into my ear. "I don't think that your showing up here has happened by chance," he said. "I think you've been given a gift. The chance to see what your life could be like if you want it badly enough." I responded with doubt, telling him I wasn't sure I was as good as he was. "Oh, Eric, you still don't get it, do you?" he replied. "I'm not better than you. I am you. The you that you're supposed to be. I'm the vision of your potential, providing, of course, that you're willing to do what it takes. Yes, this has been a gift to you, a gift I need you to accept." He hugged me, and in that embrace, I finally understood. He was my potential manifest, and he needed me to overcome my self-imposed limitations so that he could eventually exist. He broke the embrace and walked toward the center of the stage to address the cheering crowd, delivering a message I knew could change my life. Just then, a man with headphones tapped my shoulder, informing me that the cameraman was getting me in the shot and asking me to move off the stairs. I agreed and turned to leave. As I turned, the heel of my shoe caught on the step. I lost my balance and fell in slow motion toward the floor below. My only thought as I plummeted was a resigned, "Not again." Chapter 20. 9. Dorothy goes home. The first sensation to return was the sound of Elaine's voice. She was speaking to someone, confirming that yes, she still wanted to speak with Dr. Weiss, and yes, she recalled meeting him the previous night, and yes, she was fully aware it was Sunday morning. Even in my haze, I recognized that my wife was not a woman who accepted no easily. The second sensation was a dull, rhythmic throbbing behind my right ear. I forced my eyes open and found myself lying in a hospital bed. Elaine was deep in conversation with a nurse, while my brother Carl sat nearby, engrossed in a copy of People magazine. "Aren't you supposed to be counting beans somewhere?" I mumbled toward Carl. "It's the middle of tax season still, isn't it?" Carl looked up, startled, and Elaine spun around, rushing to the bedside with tears filling her eyes. She managed to choke out that she had been incredibly worried. Confused, I asked what day it was. "Sunday," she replied. She explained that early Thursday morning I had somehow fallen out of bed. The doctor believed I had struck my head on the nightstand before hitting the floor. A double impact that resulted in a severe concussion. I stared at them in disbelief. I had been unconscious for 4 days. The nurse returned to check my vitals, assuring us that everything looked normal and that the doctor would arrive shortly. She instructed me to rest. Instead, I spent the next 20 minutes recounting the entire saga to Carl and Elaine. I told them about waking up 10 years in the future, meeting my older, more successful self, and the profound realizations I had about my career and life. I even described the round of golf I had played at Pebble Beach. Carl listened intently, remarking that it sounded wonderful, and suggesting we plan a trip to play there for real, after tax season, of course. As we waited for the doctor, a thought struck me. I frantically searched for the page I had ripped from the book, the chart of the 5 failure levels that was supposed to be my proof. The search yielded nothing. The experience had felt so visceral, so undeniable, that it was almost impossible to accept it had been a hallucination. But as the reality of the hospital room settled in, I had to accept the truth. It had been nothing more than a dream. Epilogue. 6 months later, September arrived with the characteristic heat of Southern California. I stepped out of the company Oldsmobile, checked my watch, and walked briskly toward the corporate headquarters of Callaway Golf. My records indicated that I had already called on this account 4 times, collecting a total of 17 no's from 3 different individuals. Since returning to work following my concussion, my career had transformed. I had claimed the #1 sales ranking in 3 of the last 5 months and was a serious contender for Salesman of the Year. My income had surged, exceeding what I had earned in the entire previous year. But the statistic I cherished most was my commanding lead in the number of failed attempts to lease a copier. I knew that as long as I dominated that category, success was inevitable. The receptionist escorted me to the office of Robert Merrill, the vice president. It was our first meeting. He began by trying to dismiss me immediately, stating that I was wasting my time because they were satisfied with their current supplier and locked into a 3-year contract. However, noting my persistence, he gave me 15 minutes. By the time the clock ran out, Merrill had politely told me no 3 more times. But he also admitted he liked aspects of my presentation and suggested I schedule a follow-up with his secretary, conceding that their contract situation wasn't as rigid as he had initially claimed. It had taken 5 meetings and over 20 rejections, but the door was finally cracking open. As I stood to leave, a framed photograph on the wall stopped me cold. It was a view of the 7th green at the La Costa Resort. "You play golf?" Merrill asked. "Not as much as I like," I replied, unable to tear my eyes away from the image. "I'll bet this picture was taken from the balcony of your house just down the hall from the master bedroom." Merrill was stunned. "As a matter of fact, it was. How could you possibly know that?" I almost told him the truth, that I had been there, but stopped myself. "Just a guess," I said. "It's a wonderful house. I'm going to miss it." He looked confused. "You're moving?" "No," I clarified. "I mean you, when you decide to sell." He laughed, admitting that while he had work left to do, his wife had her heart set on retiring to Scottsdale eventually. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a business card, and wrote my home number on the back. I handed it to him, instructing him not to call a real estate agent when he was ready to sell. I told him I was the person who was going to buy his house. He asked if I was certain. "Not just certain," I replied. "It's my destiny." I turned to walk out, but Merrill called out to stop me. "Wait, you dropped something." I looked down. Beneath the chair where I had been sitting lay a folded sheet of paper. Even before I picked it up, I knew exactly what it was. It was the page I had ripped from the book in my dream, the chart of the 5 failure levels. It was the proof I had been looking for, waiting for me in the reality I was just beginning to create. Site should start. Site 6:30 to 6:55.